Hi, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Manu, and I am a CSIC Research Associate in Infrastructure Asset Management. And today I'm going to talk to you about the project that we have here, working with Dr. Ajit and Dr. Jennifer on risk-informed bridge monitoring. Just to set the scene in picture here. So bridges, as we all know, are crucial points of connection in our transportation network. And they have strategic relevance, and since they support access to a lot of emergency services, even utilities, businesses, and quite often you will find that rural communities are connected to the major transport networks using bridges. So ideally, a single bridge will have multiple stakeholders who will have different priorities from that. And these multiple interests needs to be captured and considered while managing the bridge to improve the value of our transport system. So why is it necessary is because when we are which we will talk about a bit later, but when we are setting up a business case for monitoring or any other decision within our asset management strategy, it is necessary to see how it impacts our different stakeholders, if it benefits them or how it impacts them. So managing transport infrastructures or bridges are often considered at two levels. So one is at the network level, another one at the project level. So while the budget availability drives the decision making at the network level, the engineering or the asset condition or even the structural health of a bridge triggers maintenance interventions at the project level. But knowledge on the actual condition of the asset plays a very important role within decision making at both levels. However, what we see is that due to infrequent inspections and lack of continuous monitoring, we often do not have adequate information on the condition of the bridge. For example, in terms of defects like bridge scarce, we do not have much information because inspections are quite less, or the frequency of the inspections are quite large. So this gives rise to uncertainties within our decision making. So the visual inspection, which is commonly used, is less accurate, and continuous monitoring using sensors or satellites, that gives us a better value because it enables a smarter and a proactive asset management. But again, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, there is a lack of a business case for monitoring bridges and managing them effectively under such constraints of budgets or resources. So we have developed a risk-informed approach to arrive at such a trade-off. So the trade-off between the costs and the value of information gathered through these different monitoring techniques against a given risk level of failure of a bridge. So in other words, preparing the business case for monitoring. So let us consider this situation where over time, a defect is initiated and it will reach a point where the defect attains unacceptable state, which might result in a risk of failure or closure of for a prolonged period of time. So with impacts of climate change coming into picture, these defects might attain that particular unacceptable state at a faster rate, for example, in case of scarce as well. So it might become detectable during a detailed examination or monitoring before it is detected during a visual inspection. So for any bridge, the level of detection is related to the structural form of the bridge. It dictates whether the relevant bridge elements that we are going to monitor, be it your pier or your deck, is it accessible for examination, and to what extent is it accessible? And also to what extent does that particular defect, be it a crack or a scar, manifest itself visually? So as we mentioned earlier, a visual inspection would have high level of detection for a crack or on a masonry arch, but much lower level of detection for bridge scarce. So the earlier the defect is detected, as we all know, or even predicted to occur, it is better for maintenance and repair regimes in place. But in case of the UK, we cannot take bridge safety for granted. And as we said earlier, actual condition or the condition of the asset drives decision making across the network and project level. And we have a lack of a comprehensive asset condition data when it comes to bridges. We have approximately 40% of our 160,000 bridges are historical assets. And with a current annual maintenance backlog of approximately 4 billion, one of the major challenges that we are facing is to make our bridges resilient to a changing and uncertain climate. And with climate change coming into picture, it was reported that 1 in 20 bridges are at high risk of failure by 2080. So the bridge asset managers often need to make decisions on the basis of incomplete and uncertain information due to the lack of the asset condition data or even continuous monitoring. But while we sort of employ commonly the visual inspection, which is sort of less accurate when compared to continuous monitoring using sensors, it was estimated that spending £1 on the infrastructure monitoring technologies on our bridges or even transport infrastructure could result in a potential cost saving of over £3. But having said all that, we do not, again, have a business case or a systematic framework to see where can we prioritize that monitoring investment. It is often the case that we say, yes, we are going to monitor the high-risk bridges first and then go on. But then even within that high-risk category, which bridges do you sort of focus on? So that's the sort of idea or sort of a question that we are trying to address there. So we sort of developed a risk-informed and a data-centric approach that would allow us to make that value-based monitoring decision. So from that perspective, before sort of to take a step back there, is to see that when we are assessing and maintaining our bridges, even sort of preparing a business case for any of these asset management strategies, a very sound understanding of the operational impact of that particular bridge is sort of necessary, or even the consequences is necessary within the so-called risk assessment. So in case of like extreme events like a bridge collapse or even flooding, which might result in lane closures or even damages to bridges, the unplanned loss of the transport capacity, which could sort of necessitate traffic redistribution for a prolonged time. And that redistribution could be rerouting in terms of road to road, or even you might find people moving on from road to rail, or even if it's a rail bridge, it might be rail to road. So you have that modal change, which brings in its own complications of increase in fuel emissions and accident risks and congestion. And on top of it, it could also bring in a significant increase in user cost due to longer travel distance. So prolonged disruptions can often impact not just the user cost, but also the local businesses in that area. And if we have to take in a different way, sort of might even bring in a risk of social exclusion to the affected communities. So if you are sort of cut away from the mainstream for more than a couple of weeks. So considering all that element into it sort of brings in that discussion around that agency versus user cost when it comes to bridge asset management. So you might find that a failure might bring in environmental impacts of not just of the increase in traffic, but also if a failure of a bridge happens, the dust pollution that happens due to it, or even the water pollution that comes along with it. The third-party damages that such sort of a collapse can happen, sort of necessitate. And even on top of it, the agency might suffer from reputational damages. So sort of thinking about it from a higher level perspective helps us to better set a business case. Now, one of the example, one of the only probably quantified sort of an example of these macroeconomic impacts of bridges would be the Fourth Road Bridge closure, where it was closed over for 3 weeks and due to structural defects, and sort of resulted in a detour of 40 minutes for around 10,000 households. And you could sort of it was reported that this significant detour sort of increased from a 40-minute journey to a 3-hour because there was this increase in congestion. So we sort of also see that because of that length, or even the increase in that time happening there was a shift of car and bus users to railways. So then additionally, rail services had to be introduced to meet that demand. So finally, they sort of said that the closure of one carriageway alone was expected to cost the Scottish economy around 650,000 per day. So given the sort of values that we sort of see for bridges within our transport system, like that example there, it is quite important to be able to predict these kind of consequences. And also not just predict it, but also quantify these consequences so that we know what is the sort of impact it would have. So considering such impacts will aid our transport agencies like Network Rail or Highways England or even local authorities to identify user-centric and value-based strategies for maintaining or monitoring their bridges. So a key part of such a process is definitely to identify the bridges that are at most risk while considering their operational, structural, functional, and environmental standing. And that could be for not just overarchingly for a bridge, but for a particular defect. For example, if you take scar as an example there, you might find that some of those consequent sort of factors which result in a scar might bring in a higher risk versus a crack. So I'm talking about a generic approach here. So since the likelihood is sort of governed by these different contributing factors, the magnitude of these consequences is sort of often mediated by the life cycle costs and the macroeconomic impacts that we sort of discussed earlier. So what we're trying to do is that thinking that the value of information approach will sort of provide us a standard for acquiring and using data while carrying out any of these management activity. So it will sort of help us to understand in relation saying, what is the best monitoring strategy for a bridge access to be of a particular risk? And or even identify which bridges to monitor and to what level should they be monitored? Or even saying that what should be my inspection frequency if at all I'm saying I'm not going to do any monitoring. So that sort of discussion happens around when we sort of bring in that approaches together. And sort of to bring that approach in, that sort of informs our framework that considers the direct and indirect costs associated with bridge maintenance and disruption. So we sort of take a holistic view here and saying that the risk assessment, as you can see in the green box there, it sort of takes the view beyond just the physical bridge infrastructure, and it starts to feed into setting up business cases and business policies, and that also then considers a whole life perspective. So it sort of explains to you from a network level and also from a project level how these different, predominantly the risk assessment sort of plays a key role there. And then we have the value of information levels, which sort of acknowledges that different quality of data is required for asset management planning at different levels. So overarchingly, it sort of shows how we can consider risks and information level. So when I say information, think monitoring data. So how risk and data can sort of feed into setting our business policies, both at network and project level. So you might find that when you prepare a business case and comparing it while having a whole life cycle perspective there, you can identify strategies like, okay, I'm going to monitor or increase the inspection of my bridge, or even bring in remedial treatments or even preventive measures. So with that framework, we sort of have discussions in the last couple of months with Network Rail and Highways England. And sort of they said that that whole framework, as you saw earlier, was sort of developed with inputs from them as well. And while during in our discussion predominantly with Network Rail, they sort of highlighted that their current scar risk assessment process is unable to quantify the impact of climate change. So I should sort of mention that we sort of said we will have that framework in the whole project. We said we'll have that framework and then try to bring in scar as a case study to sort of explain that. So Network Rail said we do not consider climate change there, and we are starting to think about it. So we're now working with Network Rail to explore how the relationship between climate change and bridge scar by simulating the causal chain from climate change to the scar risk, so the whole risk assessment process. So trying to see how climate change will impact that. So to start with, we sort of adopt the UK CP18 projections to study the change in precipitation in the coming years on different scenarios. And then we employ a hydrologic modeling, which will estimate the river flow based on terrain, land use, and soil conditions, which would sort of inform and say, inform our time-based scar deterioration models, which we are sort of adapting from literature to calculate the scar depths for these different climate scenarios in the future. So having done all that 3 steps, then it would sort of inform our risk assessment process, which will consider the probability and the consequence of bridge failures due to scar. So both at project and network level. So again, the probability will be sort of calculated using a pairwise comparison approach of different contributing factors. And the consequences will be calculated using econometric models, which considers the macroeconomic impacts. So that's one project which we have sort of started with Network Rail to validate the framework and the approach that we have developed. So from that sort of picture, we then start to ask, how can we sort of deal with scar? So the efficient and the cost-effective way of dealing with scar is to monitor its evolution over time, and to accordingly then say, how can I bring in my maintenance and repair works? So the commonly used bridge monitoring technique is visual inspection, and divers are often employed to inspect the condition of the foundation and to measure the scour depth using basic instrumentations. But such an approach is particularly a disadvantage during flooding, or even in situations like when climate change induces high floods, where the risk of scouring is extremely high and the diver inspections cannot be carried out due to health and safety considerations. So an effective alternative in such a scenario is to employ instruments such as accelerometers, sensors, or satellites to gather data related to scour depth, and not just the data about the scour depth, but also the different factors that contribute to scour formation. So is it like to do with, can we look at how the surrounding area or the terrain of that area sort of impacts how the scour behaves? So that sort of an information capture will help the decision makers. So, but having said that, from that list of different techniques that we have, each of that technique will have different level of cost effectiveness, the resolution, or different capability for providing repeated and sort of reliable information. There might be a different cost when it comes to installation or even operating and maintaining it. So how do we sort of choose which one to go for within our sort of a risk assessment framework? So to that end, we developed a value of information technique, which is a decision analytic method for quantifying the potential benefit of additional information. So thinking back, the essential driver for infrastructure sensing or monitoring is to create a value of investment versus the gains that you might gain downstream if the sensors are put in place. Like, for example, if I'm able to detect my defect due to monitoring, and if it is an accurate detection, then it would trigger maintenance decision before probably sort of much earlier than a visual inspection, and accordingly help sort of reduce the failure risk or even closure risk. So that's sort of a conversation saying, what's the benefit of getting that initial information? So for new sort of structures, like for the bridges that HS2 might have, the emphasis might be on giving an early warning detection system of a deterioration happening or a defect going to happen. While for existing structures, which is predominantly what we have, the emphasis will sort of be on the monitoring of the already sort of active deterioration processes. So sort of trying to see, is that deterioration process getting aggravated, or what sort of getting that live feed, if that's the word to use. So, but having said that, in both the existing cases or even in the new bridge cases, the monitoring would be able to assess the current condition and also sort of estimate the residual life of the structure via predictions and deterioration models. So bringing that value of information approach there will sort of help us to identify what's the optimal decision path. Now, for an example which sort of we conducted, the optimal decision path there was that we should go ahead and monitor. And that sort of answers that question, should we monitor or not? And that sort of decision is based on what's the probability and outcome at each of these decision-making nodes. So if I am using satellites and if the defect exists, how accurate will be the detection of the defect using satellite versus sensors versus robots? So, and that sort of a consideration is given. And we then come into picture. It sort of gives us a thumb rule to work with, is when to monitor a bridge and when not to. So as we said earlier, usually the bridges are deemed high risk are monitored first. But having such an approach will sort of help us to identify which bridges among that high risk category or even your medium risk category should I prioritize the monitoring, especially when these sort of questions come into picture when you have budget constraints predominantly on annual maintenance and inspection budgets. And even answering the question of what monitoring technique should I employ. So if I'm using different techniques and going through that optimal path, then identifying and saying which technique for a particular risk level, for a particular bridge, will give me the maximum value, the maximum benefit. So we are now at the stage currently talking to researchers and practitioners who are using different monitoring techniques. And then we're sort of trying to inform that model there and see how these different techniques will stack up when you sort of compare these different ones. Moving forward, the work will firstly look at making the proposed approach very time dependent, and it also help us to understand how the effect it would sort of this time dependency will affect the value of our asset, and also if monitoring was initiated at different stages. And the dynamic risk assessment is also looked into to make risk assessment as a function of time. And finally, as we said earlier on the Network Rail project, we're sort of looking at the climate change impacts, and then we will sort of ask questions on what does it mean for value for monitoring. And the outcomes, we're sort of working with Network Rail and Highways England to trial these developed projects, predominantly for bridge scarce. Thank you very much.